Good day. We are the Group 1 and we are going to report the Teleological Ethics. So this is our member list and this is our table of contents. First, the Teleological Ethics will be reported by Theo de la Peña and Eunice Guerrero. Second, the Utilitarianism, which will be reported by April Cabacoy and Tricia Lopez. Consequentialism will be reported by Shairos Puerto and Greg Hemunda. Fourth, Hedonistic, which will be reported by Family Akbay and Joseph Ayag. And lastly, the Principle of Happiness, which will be reported by Clyde Segura. And lastly, the conclusion will be reported or stated by Clyde Segura. So let's start. First topic, which is the teleological ethics.
So, the word teleology is a combination of the Greek word telos, which means end or purpose, and logia means study of or a branch of learning.
Now, to further understand the teleological theory, I will be giving examples. So, first example is eating. What is the telos of eating? Again, the telos means the aim, goal, or the end. So, what is the telos of eating? Of course, to get the nutrition, to not get hungry, like to nourish our bodies or like have energy or have healthy bodies. If you're eating in a way that permits your body to be properly nourished, then that's good. If, however, eating in such a way that you are preventing your body from being nourished, like you're eating too much or eating the wrong foods, like will make you unhealthy, then it will become a moral issue or problem. Now, if you have a tapeworm, you're not responsible for that. We're not talking about the situation that you cannot control the result. As far as you permit or allow nourishment to take place, you can pick from a lot of foods. You can order from menu, or you can pick what you want, and then like put spices. But don't eat in such a way that you're preventing your body from being nourished. And that's how it works about eating. Another example is going to college, going to university. So what is the telos of going to college or going to university? It's not getting a job because college cannot control that, but it is to get an education. The telos of going to college is to get an education. Just like eating, you can choose from different schools, programs, professors and courses, and even you can join clubs like sports, choir, dancing, or even debate clubs. And as long as none of that will interfere or be a hindrance to getting an education, then it's fine. Now, however, you make something that interferes and become a hindrance to education, like join sorority or like gangs or any clubs that will interfere you in getting an education, then you'll get a problem. That's where you can have a moral issue. So that is how it works. So another is sex. So what is the telos of sex? So it is for reproduction, to procreation, and also for the pleasure. So as we all know that sex has proper context. And according to the Roman Catholic Church, that you should not do anything that will interfere with procreation. Like for example, the artificial birth controls or vasectomy. Thomas Aquinas was a Roman Catholic theologian, which the hierarchy has problems with birth control and because it interferes the procreation, which is the telos of sex. Again, telos is the aim, the goal, or the end. So another example is the masturbation. So what is the telos of masturbation? So the Roman Catholic Church, the book of Thomas Aquinas for guidance, has disagreements on this about the masturbation. So if the telos will be sexual act, then it will be considered as immoral act. However, if the telos of masturbation will be release of tension or for the health of the person, then it could be acceptable. So that is how it works about the telos, about the aim, the goal, or the end. There is a quote from Hitler, which he said that how lucky it is for rulers that men cannot think. We might wonder, what is the telos of that statement of Hitler? He wanted to achieve things. He employed the most effective ways to achieve them from his point of view. Should soldiers volunteer to get killed to achieve those goals? If they thought about it clearly, probably not. If people really thought deeply about things, it would be harder for the rulers to do what they want, even though it would be good or bad. This is according to Simon Blackburn's book, which is The Ethics, a very short introduction. He pointed out that the telos of Hitler saying that quote is this, but in saying that he sounded as if he too was blind to ethical climate that enabled his own ideas and hence his power to flourish. That is the telos. Another thing that Simon Blackburn highlighted is this: to come to power so that people will think. Thinking was poisoned by an enveloping climate of ideas, many of which may not even have been conscious, for people may not be aware of our ideas. So this is like an idea in the sense in is a tendency to accept roots or thoughts or even feelings that we may not be recognized in ourselves or even able to articulate.
Teleology, although the precise term originated in the 18th century. So, I am going to give you some information about this. Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century uses this theory on his work, which is the Critique of Judgment. Critique of Judgment is the third critique in Kant's critical project, which specifically is the biological as theological. So this is about one human being existence doing natural actions, such example is parents working for their children to have a good life. So that's where telos entered, the purpose of parents in giving their children a good life. A risk that a parents will be taking while on a process of doing the working is worth the risk, knowing that it has a good outcome. So that's it. Teleological ethics. So what is teleological ethics? Determined by its ends and primarily with goals of actions and their goodness or badness. This theory focuses on the value of an action. So, teleological focuses on the aftermath of an action that will be done. The possible outcome of the action that a person will be doing is what was being focuses while working on the steps on a work that will be acted. Teleological ethics about actions that are right as they produce and promote the greatest happiness, wrong as they promote unhappiness. Happiness refers to pleasure and the absence of pain. And happiness, on the other hand, means pain and the deprivation of pleasure. So, the teleological perspective is a group of theories that are identified by one main conviction, that is, the moral evaluation of actions, motives, or rules is based on how much good they generate or how much bad they allow us to avoid. So, consequentialism, they were sometimes mistaken with the teleology because they have the similarities in which they focuses on the end of the action. But we have to remember that consequentialism is focuses more on the consequences, while teleology focuses on calculating of every steps on what you will do for the desired outcome that you are going to do. It's about taking those steps whether it is risky, but knowing that it will be successful at the end for the sake of the money.
So these are some of the notable thinkers that contributed the teleological ethics. First, Plato, Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, and Thomas Aquinas. So here are the realizations of Plato, and this is the realizations of Aristotle. So this is Saint Thomas Aquinas. So he is a Roman Catholic theologian. So his theory of ethics was influenced by Aristotle and involved teleological thinking that drew upon divine command. So what are the three types of teleological ethics? So first, the ethical egoism, second is utilitarianism, and the third is eudaimonism. So ethical egoism, it is a theory that posits that an action is good if it produces or likely to produce results that maximize the person's self-interest. Also, it is based on the notion that it is always moral to promote one's own good, but at times avoiding personal interest could be a moral action too. Next is the utilitarianism, which holds that an action is good if it results in maximum satisfaction for a large number of people who are likely to get affected by that action. And third is eudaimonism, which posits that an action is good if it results in fulfillment of goals along with the welfare of human beings.
So, teleological theory. First is the natural law or the eudaimonism. Something is right if it fulfills its true purposes, wrong if it goes against these purposes. Something is right if it leads to well-being, wrong if it does not lead to well-being. The thinkers of this are Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. So this is very understandable. So I'm going to the next one, which is the ethical egoism. Something is right if it in one's greatest self-interest, contrasts with ethical altruism, and the thinkers are Epicurus, James Rachels, and Ayn Rand. So this ethical egoism, this is about self-interest. So this is about doing my own will for my own personal interest, even if it doesn't benefit the many. And the third one is the utilitarianism. Something is right if that action provides the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. The thinkers are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So this one will gonna be explained by the next reporter.
So this is our references. And now we are going to proceed to utilitarianism.
Let's talk about utilitarianism. So we prepare a question that we will able to answer after we discuss the concept of utilitarianism. So the question is, what if you choose pleasure over pain, but that pleasure will pain someone? Will you stop pleasuring yourself to make others comfortable? So the definitions of utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. So basically, the utilitarianism, the rightness and wrongness of the actions of an individual will be identified or determined through the outcomes of that action. So the foundations of utilitarianism is the principles of utility that states that the actions or behavior are right if they promote happiness or pleasure, wrong as they tend to produce unhappiness or pain. So this theory maintains that the morality of a human actions is determined by its usefulness. So generally held to be the view that if the actions of an individual will produce more pleasure, then it is morally right or it is a good action, and that actions will be useful. And if an individual will produce more pain than pleasure, then that the actions of that individual will be immoral or bad, and that actions will be not useful. It holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of individuals. So the utilitarianism is opposite of egoism because utilitarianism should produce the pressure should produce the greatest number for the greatest number of individuals, not only for yourself, not only for one person, but it should produce greatest good for the greatest number of individuals. It seeks pleasures not just for ourselves, but also for the pleasures or happiness of many individuals. So the most important classical utilitarian are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So these two utilitarian have different idea about what is utilitarianism is. So for Bentham, for him, the utilitarianism is came from principle of utility. Then for Mill, it's greatest happiness or the greatest pleasure. Bentham emphasizes pleasures while Mill emphasizes happiness.
For the example of the definition for this one, or example of like a situation on this one is Robin Hood. So the act of stealing is not right. We all know that. However, the result, the outcome is stealing from the rich and give it to the poor does create the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. So that would explain the definition of utilitarianism. So there are two formulations of utilitarianism. One is the act of utilitarianism, in which Bentham is sometimes referred to an act of utilitarian because, in his view, each time you need to consider each act individually. So it is the concept that believes that the morality of an action is determined by its usefulness to the most of the people. To this act, it is in accordance with the moral rules since it brings greater good or happiness. The second one would be the rule of utilitarianism, wherein it was John Stuart Mill who first proposed that happiness is generally more successfully pursued by acting on general rules than by measuring the consequence of each act. It adheres to the belief that the correctness of an action is determined by the correctness of its rules, and if the correct rule is being followed. So some scholars were uncomfortable with this rule of utilitarianism. So Mill advocated that the following general rules could be broken when necessary and sometimes known as weak rule utilitarian. By the stone rule, utilitarianism would say that utilitarian principles should establish rules that should then never be broken. So we consider this expected consequence of various acts and chose the one that maximizes happiness. After comparing the expected outcomes of the following various rules, we chose to follow the one that is likely to have the best outcome. Additionally, in the account of Bentham utilitarianism, we should act in such ways as to make the greatest number of people as happy as possible. While the Mill's utilitarianism, which is the rule of utilitarianism, is It is a principle of utility, qualitative study of pleasure, and reforming.
Let's answer the question earlier. What if you choose pleasure over pain, but that pleasure will pain someone? Will you stop pleasuring yourself to make others comfortable? So for me and for us both reporters, um, we will stop, or I will stop pleasuring myself to make other people comfortable. Because in utilitarian view, I should think the goodness or the pleasures of others than my own happiness. So sacrificing own happiness produce greatest good for others is how utilitarianism works.
Hi, my name is Greg, and I'm going to explain what is consequentialism with my partner, Rose. But first, before we proceed, I am going to ask you a question. What does it take to make our action morally right? But before we answer that, I'm going to explain what is consequentialism, and it's a viewpoint. In consequentialism, it is a normative theory that judges our actions depending on its consequences, whether it has a good or bad consequences. That means our actions or the moral quality of an action will be determined based on its consequences. If our action created a good consequences than the other one, that means our actions that we have made as morally right, based from the perspective of a consequentialist. Let's take an example here: lying to save a life. Well, obviously, we know that lying is an immoral action, but what if lying can save a life? Well, in the perspective of a consequentialist, our action here, which is an immoral action, can be justified as morally right because it has a good consequences. So let's go back to our question. What does it take to make our actions morally right? Always remember, in the viewpoint of a consequentialist, it has only one thing that makes our action morally right, and that is the good optimization of a good consequences. Always remember that in consequentialism, the moral quality of an action will be determined of its consequences.
Teleology is sometimes mistaken for consequentialism. So consequentialism is derives moral value by determining which action has the most desirable outcomes. So for example, to that is mangawat. Mangawat to help people. So that consider your action is a good consequence. Kay nangawat man ka kay para makatabang ka sa lain. And that teleology is concerned with both the ends and the means, that what you do along the path to an outcome is just as important as the outcome itself, less about gambling with potential outcomes and more about carefully considering the option of hand, at hand. So, for example to that is eating. So eating, you aim to your action is to be healthy and fit, but you interfered it na you are eating unhealthy food and skipping meals. Well, the consequence of that is that you'll be hungry or you're not healthy anymore like that. So, and that is the differences between consequentialism and teleology. Today we're going to discuss the hedonic. First, I would like to present you this phrase: too much pleasure gives us pain. Pleasure and pain pursued as a motive and action, it argues that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Pleasure equals good and pain equals bad. We do that action because we want to achieve pleasure, correct? Obviously, you do not make an action to receive pain. Pleasure and pain is a basis of an action. Teleological moral theories must somehow connect to the consequences of human action to moral concepts such as good or bad, right or wrong, or moral and immoral. The hallmark of the teleological moral theories is that
They connect this concept, the right and wrong, with the pleasure and pain, or happiness or sadness. Hence, moral acts are considered good, right, and moral. Insofar as they lead to pleasurable consequence, and bad and wrong or immoral if they lead to painful consequence. The historical moral doctrine that associates pleasure with moral goodness is called hedonism. Now, once we admit these lame premises of hedonism, we find ourselves faced with a number of different issues. Now, ethical hedonism is the idea that all people have the right to do everything in their power to achieve the greatest amount of pleasure possible to them. And according to Bentham, he believes that the consequence of our actions should produce more pleasure than pains. In order to be judged as good, if it produces more pains than pleasures, then it should be judged as bad. As like what I've said earlier, if it's moral, it's pleasure. However, if immoral, then it's pain. Now, to further discuss that, when human beings experience pleasure or pain, we immediately acknowledge that both are subject to greater and lesser degrees. Hence, according to many hedonists, pleasure and pain can be quantified, and therefore their doctrine seems unable to quantitative analysis. Most hedonists observe that pleasure can be measured in quantitative terms such as intensity, duration, fecundity, and likelihood. In general, the intensity and duration, physical or bodily pressure accompany the fulfill of basic biological functions, and therefore are largely magnified by depredation, that is to say, being hungry, thirsty, or horny. For example, getting home late. So what's the telos there? The telos there is having, for example, you're having fun with your friends, and that's the result, and the consequence or the result is you got home late. However, your goal there is to have fun. Therefore, that is the pleasure. However, the pain is you got scolded by your parents. So you can level it up for whether which is more pleasure or pain. So that is the hedonism pertains like.
So now I am going to discuss about the hedonic calculus. So hedonic calculus is also known as the philosophic calculus, and it is introduced by Jeremy Bentham, who is a English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer regarded as the founder of modern utilitarianism. So hedonic calculus is used to measure the value of an action when making a moral decision. So the hedonic calculus, as suggested by Bentham, is based on assessing possible pleasures according to their first, intensity, second, duration, third, certainty, fourth, propinquity, fifth is fecundity, sixth, purity, and lastly is the extent. So I will explain them individually later on. So these are the 7 variables which serve as the basis for measuring the morality of an action based on their pain and pleasure. Okay, so first we are going to discuss the intensity. So before that, these 7 variables are categorized into 2 categories. So the first category is pleasure or pain considered by itself. So the variables that belong to this category is intensity, the duration, the certainty, and the propinquity. While in the second category, which is the properties of the event or action produced by the pleasure or pain, not properties of the pleasure or pain itself. So the variables under this category are fecundity, purity, and extent. So the first variable is intensity. So in the description, it says how intense is the pleasure or pain. So ang intensity is, gina-ask niya ang question na kung unsa ba kagrabe ang impact or unsa ba kagrabe ang pleasure or ang pain na imong makuha sa isa ka bagay na imong gi-decide na i-commit. So, and second is the duration. And it asks how long does the pleasure or pain last. So, in duration, pwede po natin siya connect sa first variable which is the intensity. So sa duration, gina-ask niya ang question na ng unsa ba kadugay mag-exist ang pleasure or ang pain sa isa ka bagay na imong gi-choose na i-commit. And third is certainty. What is the probability that the pleasure or pain will occur? So it asks the question, how sure are you na 100% nimo makuha ang pleasure or ang pain sa isa ka bagay once you choose to commit that thing. And the fourth one is the propinquity. How far off in the future is the pleasure or pain? So now let's proceed to the second category, which is the properties of the event or the action produced by the pleasure or pain, not properties of the pleasure or pain itself. So these last three variables, which are fecundity, purity, and extent, are not the properties itself, but they are just the causes of the pain or the pleasure. So the first one is the fecundity. So it asks the question, what is the probability that the pleasure will lead to another pleasure? So sa fecundity is gina-ask niya ang question na how sure or certain are you na consistent siya na pleasure lang ang kinalabasan sa imong decision or pain lang ang kinalabasan sa imong decision. So ana siya. And next one is the purity. What is the probability that the pain will lead to other pains? So sa purity is same siya sa fecundity. Ang purity is nag-a-ask po siya about sa consistency sa imong decision kung sure ba ka na kung ano mo ang pleasure sa isa ka bagay is dapat dili na siya mag-lead into pain. And the last one is the extent. How many persons are affected by the pleasure? So, extent is the range sa imong decision kung gina-ask niya ang question kung unsa kadako ang population na pwede maapektuhan sa imong decision. So, let's move to the second table. So, just similar to the first table, in the first variable is the intensity. So, in the description, it says that intensity describes the strength of pleasure. Kung unsa ka grabe or unsa ka impactful ang pleasure or pain sa imong decision na or sa isang bagay na imong i-commit. And next one is the duration or the length of the experience of the pleasure. So duration, it explains about time sa pleasure or pain sa isa ka bagay na maging result sa imong i-commit. And the next one is the certainty or uncertainty, likelihood that pleasure will occur. So it refers to kung how certain you are that the pleasure will surely occur. And then next one is the propinquity or the remoteness. So it asks the question, how soon there will be pleasure? So how long will it take for the pleasure to happen if you commit the decision? And then the next one is the fecundity. So it refers to the chance it has of being followed by sensations of the same kind. So like I stated a while ago, the fecundity refers to the consistency of the result of your actions. If the pleasure will follow after the pleasure or if the pain will follow after the pain. So the second one is the purity. So it refers to the chance that it has of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind. So it is just similar. Purity is just kind of similar to fecundity because it also refers or describes the consistency of the result of your actions. So the last one is the extent. It talks about the number of persons who are affected by the pleasure or pain. So in the extent, it refers to the population who will be affected of your decision, whether if it is pleasure or pain. So that's all. Thank you.
Should humanity not be characterized by pursuing things nobler than mere pleasure? If that's our aim, how are we better than pigs? Good day, everyone. I'm Clyde Segura, your last reporter. And before we answer the question, first, we need to know what is the principle of happiness and understand it all. It says that the greatest happiness principle is actions that are moral if they promote utility or happiness, but are immoral if they promote the opposite. Or if you commit an action that provides happiness without pain, then that action is moral. If the action does not cause happiness without pain, then that action is immoral. For example, you suppose to choose between going to your friend's house tonight to study together or staying home studying alone. If you enjoy studying together with your friend but do not enjoy studying alone and nobody else will be affected, then you should go to your friend's house because it creates more happiness. So that is the point of the greatest happiness principle. To understand more, the general idea behind utilitarianism is set out by two of its early adherents and founders, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Jeremy Bentham describes his greatest happiness principle. In Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, a 1789 publication in which he writes, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do." John Stuart Mill had many years to absorb and reflect on Jeremy Bentham's thoughts on utilitarianism by the time he published his own work, Utilitarianism, in 1863. The key passage from this book, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. There are three generally accepted actions of utilitarianism, or the three core principles of the greatest happiness principle. First is pleasure or happiness is the only one thing that has intrinsic value. Second is actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they promote unhappiness. And third is everyone's happiness counts equally. In the third principle, the standard is not only the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether of everyone. For Mill, the end is pursuing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, no matter if it is vicious or virtuous by other standards. If Aristotle tends to focus more on the individual's development, Mill, on the other hand, is concerned with happiness overall. Next is, for John Stuart Mill, pleasure comes from in two flavors, the intellectual pleasures and physical pleasures. For the intellectual pleasures is those activities that we involve through our lifetime that bring us a greater pleasure a sense of inner accomplishment, and we were happy as a result of that. Examples: you save someone's life, you do a good deed. You decide to study for half a day, put in the effort, and you get a perfect score in exam. For the physical pleasure, this is those activities that includes physical. For example, eating food, taking a nap, having sex, nature, art, or numerous social pleasures. So John Stuart Mill, higher and lower pleasures. So as you can see in this picture, higher is intellectual while lower is physical or bestial. So in the higher section, there is listening to Mozart, reading Shakespeare, and studying philosophy. So this is under in intellectual. While in lower is going out with your partner, playing pub darts, and drinking 5 pints of beer. So this is under in the physical or bestial rather. But there are situations where no decision would be considered totally without harm or pain, and situations where it's difficult to determine which action is the better option when it comes to choosing between two actions or activities. That's why there's a little bit more information necessary. Quantity versus quality. So for Betham, he is onto quantity of pleasures because he believes that all pleasures are of equal value, but should determine the decision like what brings about the most pleasures so that you seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Contrarily, Mill contends that because people select one enjoyment above others, not all pleasure is created equal. Additionally, he asserts that mental pleasures or intellectual pleasures surpass physical ones or physical pleasures. It indicates his preference for quality over quantity. In his statement that it is better to be dissatisfied human being than a pig satisfied, and better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a foolish satisfied. And for me, based on my understanding, that it is better to be knowledgeable than to lack of intelligence. Like Mill is saying that self-awareness and intellect are more valuable, even if it means we are less satisfied with life. Better to be being than things and questions than live in a blissful ignorance. So back to the question. Should humanity not be characterized by pursuing things nobler than mere pleasure? If that's our aim, how are we better than pigs? For me, yes, we are better to pigs because we are not foolish. We may still be living in a cave instead of buildings if we were all pleased with what we had. Forget about electricity, television, cell phones, microwaves, air conditioning, and robotics. Forget about cars, buses, trains, rockets, and satellites. Also forget about globalization. So our lives have improved because someone was determined to innovate, to improve rather than be content with what he or she had. Conclusion. There can never be an ethical system that perfectly represents everything society demands. So if you're looking for one to adhere to, keep that in mind. There can never be one that entirely separates right from wrong with no room for error. It's complicated issues, And learning to understand ethics will never be easy, right? Many of the principles presented by utilitarians and the greatest happiness principle can help you live a moral, ethical, and happy life. However, depending on your ideals, you may choose to approach your life and relationships using one of the numerous distinct ethical frameworks and principles. There is no shortage of um, advice on how to live the most ethically. For instance, theological focuses on the aftermath of an action that will be done. The possible outcome of the action that a person or a group will be doing is what was being focuses while working the step on the work that will be acted. Um, Theology is a common practice in ethics, as the definition implies. Using theology in ethics means you consider and explain actions based on the end result. Some might consider stealing is bad, but a theological thinker may say, but in the end, I'm stealing to feed my food, which is good. So the action is good. In other words, an action's goodness is based on the outcome or aftermath. Second is utilitarianism. The action will be determined as morally right if it produces greatest pleasure. And if it promotes pain or unhappiness, then the action will be immoral. Greatest good for the greatest number of people is the main point of it. So there are several examples of utilitarianism in today's society. One example is when legislators make judgments on which laws to enact. Before making a decision, they frequently examine which option will result in the most happiness for the greatest number of individuals. Another example is when individuals contribute to charity. And another example of utilitarianism is in personal decision making, like when you prefer to have a modest wedding instead of a grand one because you feel it would be more joyful for everyone involved. Utilitarianism in general aims to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people possible. Any circumstance requiring a choice can benefit from this approach of thinking. Next, consequentialism. A moral quality of action is determined of its consequence. It is important because it looks for moral goodness in the consequence of our action and not the action itself. For example, we believe that lying is wrong because we know that, in general, lying produces bad consequences. But if lying would help save a person's life, consequential ethics says it's the right thing to do. Hedonism, a pleasure or the absence of pain, is the most important principle in determining the morality of a potential course of action. For example, if you are so determined in your study, though you may encounter pain or hardships, it can still be considered a moral action because the result is you finish schooling, you get an amazing job, get a house, buy whatever you want, and etc. Lastly is the greatest happiness principle. It is moral if the action produces happiness, but immoral if the action produces unhappiness. So, how can you know whether everything is being done correctly? For yourself and others, you'll need to make the morally best choices you can, and then make sure you can live with those choices in the long run. Decide what you want the quality of your life and the lives of others around you to be. The following ethics may be helpful to you as you look for greater purpose in your life. There are many ways to judge what is right and wrong. With the right support, it is possible to live a fulfilling and happy life. And that brings us to the end. I sincerely appreciate your time and attention today. Thank you so much for your time and interest. That's all.